Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. William Haldeman, the author of Meeting the Moment, Inspiring Presidential Leadership That Transformed America. This is his first book, but he's no stranger to presidential leadership. He's served on the White House Domestic Policy Council, has worked for several presidents, two secretaries of state, and is vice chancellor at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Haldeman.
Evan, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. For the second time in American history, we are embarking on a new presidential term with the best possible clues for how the new president will lead. Of course, that's because Donald Trump has already served as president. Dr. Haldeman argues that leadership qualities are forged over a lifetime and that those qualities are given voice by a president who taps them in just the right way to urge the nation forward with their one-of-a-kind bully pulpit. So first of all, Dr. William, what are the most important ways that you think Donald Trump's past, he's had a host of sort of entertainment odd jobs, impacts the way he uses the bully pulpit to make the changes he wants?
It's an interesting time. Obviously, this is the second time we've had a president come in with a non-consecutive term, the first time being Grover Cleveland. So we have a somewhat of a precedent for that. But I think if you look at President Trump in terms of his background, he's always been someone who's been able to drive communications. And I think what's important about this book is this aspect of communication through line through that. And I think you see Roosevelt dominating the radio at a time when the radio was the medium of choice. You see John Kennedy with the onset of television and dominating that. And I think what you see with President Trump is someone who has dominated social media that has helped carry him to the White House. And I think that when you talk about communication, I think that that's one of his defining qualities, and not in terms of something he's been able to leverage. But I think you look at that aspect of he certainly has carried a sense of confidence in terms of his governance, and maybe an element of bravado as well. So I think that that's probably what you've seen in the first term. There's been aspects of ingenuity with his administration in terms of driving a COVID vaccine and others. But I think you see this aspect of being able to be a really good communicator in the sense of getting his message out.
In your view, do you think presidents need to serve during difficult times to be considered a great leader? It just so happens that George Washington was the first president, so that was inherently difficult. Abraham Lincoln was president during the Civil War, partly created because of how the South perceived him. And FDR, of course, served during World War II, and those are generally considered the top three. Some other ones, for instance, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, um, uh, George H.W. Bush might say, well, I didn't have the luck, the fortune of having one of these extremely dramatic things happening during my term in office, so I didn't get to have a chance to be in the top three. But do you think that that's a fair way to judge who was great and who isn't?
I think it certainly helps to have gone through crises that are transformative in the country, but I think that there's lessons to be learned from every president. And I think when you talk some of more of the modern leaders, I think good history is written after 30 or 40 years, and you have time and perspective to see what was the impact of those leaders on that time. But I certainly think that it helps. It certainly does help to have gone through those. But again, that doesn't mean that even if you've gone through them, you're going to be successful, right? So there's some of if you look at Lincoln going through the Civil War, his predecessors really didn't meet the moment in the 1840s, 1850s to prevent the Union from going or splitting the Union in terms of the Civil War. So I think it really depends on the leader and the circumstance.
How did you pick the six presidents you profiled? You picked George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, and I'm missing one. Am I not? No, I got all six. Uh, how did you pick those six?
So really, if you look at what historical polls from the C-SPANs to the Wall Street journals to what historians traditionally view as the best presidents is in essentially what you just mentioned a few moments ago. There's a general top 10, top 15, and I wanted to look at presidents within that scope and see what was it about them that was transformational. What was the key quality in each of them that you could tease out for your own leadership journey. And I think in looking at that, what are the key moments in American history and who are the presidents that define them? Were they How did they meet that moment? How did they answer the bell in those moments? So I mean, you look at those 10 or so presidents, that was essentially a starting point.
George Washington, and we're going to go through them right now because what better way to get this conversation going than just knocking it around with the six you mentioned? So, George Washington, um, over recent years, historians have become very comfortable saying he was not perfect, but he was great when it mattered. And we have most often on this show, we've talked about it several times, his decision to leave after two terms. What were the clues that he left us that he would show us the way to hand power down from president to president?
Well, I'll start back with your original comment about him not being perfect. He was someone that was not classically educated. He didn't have the education of a John Adams or a Thomas Jefferson in a classical sense. He had really nothing more than a grade school education. What he learned he learned by doing. He learned essentially through combat. Combat became his classroom. He learned through experience, and that helped form his judgment. I would argue from that he gained a wealth of knowledge that ultimately, when you talk about the farewell address, was 4 decades of his experience and knowledge that he was transferring to the American people for posterity. This was his not only just a farewell address to the president, but really lessons learned over 4 decades of service. And if you talk about what he was trying to impart, I think there's I think three core lessons from that. And one, he wanted to talk about this aspect of concern around party spirit. He was concerned about national unity. In the 1790s was one of the most divisive periods in American history. And I think for him, this aspect of national unity was so critical that three generations later would drive us to civil war. He was very concerned about making sure the Union stayed together at such a nascent, early, mainspring time in our nation. The second one he was very concerned about was foreign intrigue, this aspect of really seeing foreign influence in our politics. In the 1794 off-year elections, he had to recall the French ambassador because of interference in the congressional elections, and that harkens back into what we've heard in more recent times in terms of Russian interference and such. So you see that concern that even back in Washington's day, it continues into our own time. And then I think the last big piece I would say is this aspect of pretended patriotism, is what he called it. And he was very concerned of people like Thomas Jefferson, who had an affinity for the French, maybe even to a point for America. I wouldn't go that far, but he just had an affinity for the French. And I think that there's concerns about really that we are American. We need to kind of rally behind our own people first. I mean, we are American in that sense. So I would say those are the three lessons, in addition to other things that he mentioned. But those are the three core lessons out of the farewell address.
I'll ask you to put him on the couch just a hair here. Is there something earlier in his life that indicated that he would be willing to not hold power forever?
Yeah, of course. And I think one of the most important moments in American history, not so much presidential history because the presidency hadn't started yet, but Washington was the commanding general of the Revolutionary Army over the course of the Revolution. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, he could have been king. He could have been a monarch himself. But he decided to hand over his sword back to Congress. Congress had instilled in him the service and to be general, and he handed that back. And in a tearful goodbye to Congress in Annapolis, Maryland at the time, he handed over his sword, and he was the first leader really in 2 millenniums to do that. King George III said, there's never been anyone of his kind to do that. It's just an act of that surprised everybody across the world at the time. And I think that moment really helped propel him to be president, to show that he valued the nation and the office above his own ego, even though he had a huge ego. I mean, George Washington had a humongous ego, but that moment, I think, instilled in America the sense of that he was noble, had integrity, and that he would do right by the American people in terms of being the first president.
Skipping ahead two presidents, to Thomas Jefferson, it's interesting because the America that George Washington left behind would not even be remotely close to the America that Thomas Jefferson would leave behind, just in terms of the size. I mean, it is unbelievable to look at the size of the Louisiana Purchase, and it is inconceivable to have an America, to us at least, to have an America today that doesn't include all of that territory. And you say that the keys to that purchase are found in his writing. Explain how Thomas Jefferson developed not only this pen that could write beautiful language, but also very persuasive language, that this is something that we need to try.
So in 1802, April 18th, 1802, Jefferson was in his office at the White House, which was then now is essentially the Lincoln dining room at the White House now. And he penned a letter to Robert Livingston, which was his chief diplomat in France. And he was very concerned at the time about the French intervention into the western part of the United States, to have a control of the port of New Orleans, which basically controlled the Mississippi River, which James Madison at the time called it the Hudson, the Delaware, the Potomac, and all the navigable rivers of the Atlantic states basically formed into one stream. It was everything. It was driving the economic development of the South, of the West. It went back to the Revolution times in terms of how much of a critical issue the access to the Mississippi was. And there was control of the Mississippi by Spain, and then Napoleon comes in and makes a secret deal with Spain to gain control of this. And it was unbeknownst to Jefferson when he became president, and through some diplomatic channels, he was aware that Napoleon had acquired this, with intention to build an American colony for the French not only in the Caribbean, but in the southern part of the United States. So Jefferson knew having access to the Mississippi was critical. He knew that this was probably the existential threat of not only his presidency, but for America's growth more broadly. So he penned this letter. He also set up a diplomatic back channel with a gentleman named Dupont, who he had known when he was a diplomat in France before America became a nation, and really set the groundwork to try to secure the Louisiana territory. His goal wasn't the entire swath that it ended up becoming. He just wanted access to New Orleans and to have access to the Mississippi, which at the time, the Mississippi River was the boundary for the United States that came out of the peace treaty out of the Revolutionary War. So long story short of that is, through a little bit of luck, a little bit of serendipity, also a lot of work by Jefferson to back channel, to send James Monroe to support Robert Livingston in this process. The treaty ultimately came available to Jefferson in a way that wasn't deemed possible, especially because the British wanted to invade and fight the French, which opened up an opportunity. So it was a lot of luck, but also a lot of ingenuity on Jefferson's part to make that happen.
When it comes to the Louisiana Purchase, um, it would have to be considered the key expansion and sort of the unlocking of this idea that America, over the next 30 years, would occupy the entire continent.
Yeah, that along with James Polk, I think, in getting us to expanding us to the Pacific Ocean, certainly made us a continental nation. And we would never have been a continental nation without Jefferson. And I think in many ways, you probably will touch on a little bit later in this conversation, but this element of Theodore Roosevelt helping to really 100 years later after the Louisiana Purchase, much of that land dedicating that to national forests and national parks. And so you see that development over the course of 100 years and more.
If Thomas Jefferson was a beautiful writer, Abraham Lincoln became known for his beautiful speeches. One in particular, we've all had that moment where we kind of stop life for a second and we are either at a museum or you see it in a book and we just read the Gettysburg Address. It is an unbelievably beautiful articulation of what it means to be an American and to inherit a country that is being passed down from generation to generation. I saw it at the Seward House outside Ithaca, New York. I guess it's in Auburn, New York. And I saw a copy of it that was basically given to James Seward, and it was just incredible to see this, if there's such thing as an original copy of it. What does it say about Lincoln that he never thought that anybody, and he says it in the speech, no one's ever going to remember what we say here? What does it say about him?
I mean, I think there's an element of humbleness, certainly, but I also think it's just his ability to communicate at a time. In 272 words, he said more than what Everett had said in 2 hours in the speech prior to Lincoln coming on the stage. It's amazing, right? 2 hours. They gave Edward Everett a bathroom just so he could talk for 2 hours and lay out the battle and the battlefield. But Lincoln did in really 2 minutes what Everett couldn't do in 2 hours, and across 272 words, which 10 sentences, very minute about it. I think
Is that all it is? 10 sentences?
10 sentences, that's
Oh
it.
my.
Four paragraphs, 10 sentences. And you think about what he said, and Lincoln was someone that was very critical about every word choice, every syllable, how it alliterated off the tongue. In and really, what's 272 words is half an op-ed, right? It's
Right.
just how small this is. And you think about, to me, what resonates in this speech is the word dedicate or dedicated is used 6 times. You wouldn't use the same word 6 times, like a critical word like that in an op-ed. You wouldn't do that. And in good writing, you would spread the wealth in terms of that. But he was so clear about what that means. And I think that for me, he exhibited that element of dedication, not only in that address, but across his life and to the Union. And I think that for someone who, again, valued every word choice, that to me was so meaningful in terms of that address.
The fact that we've remembered it all these years, and it has inspired generations of students and of leaders. Um, is it possible to say that it is the greatest articulation of American life?
Curious about the forces shaping global trade? Current Accounts, the Henrik Foundation Trade Podcast dives into trade policy, economics, and global trends, from the rise of protectionism to the challenges of non-tariff barriers. Brought to you by the Henrik Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to sustainable global trade. This podcast delivers valuable insights for policymakers, business leaders, and educators. Subscribe now on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Stay informed and shape the future of global trade.
Yeah, yes. I would argue that I think it's the greatest speech in American history, American presidential history. It connects us with the past, the present, and the future. When it's really three different strands, and when he ties it back not to the Constitution, but really is a representation of Thomas Jefferson's thesis in the Declaration of Independence, and tying it back to the meaning of Gettysburg, the meaning of what those soldiers fought for, back to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This aspect of the unborn millions, which George Washington has talked about, this idea that it's about the next generation. And I think so. We talk about that sense of history. I think that's what this speech does.
Lincoln left us a united country. It took generations after that to figure out how to protect it, to make sure that it would be protected. And as you say, Teddy Roosevelt, and I feel bad for you because you took it on in a relatively, in one chapter in a shorter book. I mean, books and books have been written about Teddy Roosevelt's efforts to preserve this country, and they're long books. Some of them are really long. His first address to Congress is an articulation of, we have this beautiful land, but we've got to save it for not just ourselves, but for the next generation. Take us back to the early 1900s. What environmental concerns were there, and how did this idea of environmentalism take voice in Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that had been percolating as in terms of presidential action, even going back to Abraham Lincoln. And there was a strand through this. There's a sense of Grant in Yellowstone, and Benjamin Harrison has a pretty good record on conservation in terms of forestry. But I think that there's aspects between the eradication of natural resources, between like logging industry. You saw the gold rush come in, and it felt like there was an endless supply of natural resources, and these resources were consumed at a breakneck pace, and largely without recourse at the time. There was no protections on it. And it really created an existential threat to water and wildlife and forests and the frontier more broadly. So I think that you see these aspects of no guardrails on natural provisions. And I think also in the West, there was this issue of there was no access to water and irrigation in terms of the survival of crops or livestock. And many people and farms were teetering in the balance on there. If you didn't live next to a river system, you were not going to survive out there. And I think what was interesting about Roosevelt is you can harken back to his Valentine's Day in 1884, when he lost his wife and his mother on the same day. He was so distraught about that, he went out to the Badlands in Medora, North Dakota, and really just to try to find himself. And here these aspects of nature and the environment and seeing what was needed for Western expansion really became part of him, to the point where you say his first State of the Union address, he took on these issues that were an existential threat, but weren't front and foremost in the political vernacular at the time. They weren't the talk in the cloakrooms of the House and the Senate or the Congress at the time. And I think it's important that he saw that as an opportunity. He had the courage to take that on at a time when maybe others wouldn't have.
Your book is all about these roots that these leaders had and developed over the course of their lives. You mentioned it, but I think we should talk about the theme of Teddy Roosevelt, not just going to, out into the Badlands to kill buffalo and to sort of be gory about it, but it was really about him developing this intimate relationship with our environment. How important do you think that was to his overall thesis that we've got to protect what we have?
I think it was central to who he was. I mean, he started, even as a boy, he loved natural history. He was, up until when he went to college, he was still thinking about going and developing that as a major. He even went to his dad and asked him if that was okay if he pursued it, because his dad I mean, his dad was a wealthy magnate in New York. He was someone who was front and center in terms of economic development and those types of things. And certainly that type of occupation wouldn't have been financially as open as what his father has had experienced, or his family lineage, but it's something that he loved to do. Ultimately in college he went in a different direction, and politics became part of that. But I think it's important to think that strand never left him along his way. And it only in probably the most important, one of the most trying, important moments of his life, when his wife and mother died on the same day, it was from that grief that one of his primary interests as a boy, as a child growing up, became part and parcel of who he was and who he would become as president of the United States.
Let's talk about his cousin. Maybe the most confident man to ever live. If anyone's more confident than Teddy Roosevelt, it would be FDR. Many presidents are very confident and exude confidence. Certainly, we're about to see Donald Trump back in office, Bill Clinton filled with confidence, JFK filled with confidence, but really nobody compares to FDR riding down the street with the cigarette lit in, with the cigarette holder puffing out of the open car. The way he exudes this feeling of I'm in control, and I think American, that Doris Kearns argues that feeling radiated out to the American people and provided confidence when there were not a lot of reasons to have confidence. How does that work? Why does presidential attitude start to trickle down?
I mean, I think confidence in any leaders is critical, and I think across American history, that those who exude the confidence are the ones that, again, we've talked about who are the best presidents. You may not have a crisis like Theodore Roosevelt had a crisis, not in terms of a war crisis or a depression, but he had a crisis in terms of conservation and these types of things. But I think they help to have, through these crises, helps to have someone who has a natural propensity for confidence. Because if you lose the feeling, or you lose the confidence of the American people, or they don't feel like you can pull through, or you're going to carry them to the next level, or through a crisis, you're lost. And I think you see that in someone like Herbert Hoover, a great president in the sense of who, in terms of coming in 1820 or 1928. There was no one more prepared for that moment than him in terms of the CV. He was 2 terms as Secretary of Commerce during the 1920s. He was the great humanitarian. That was his nickname coming out of World War II. And so to deal with a depression, someone who has the economic chops, someone who is seen as empathetic and as a humanitarian, you would think that would be the person that could lead us through that. And he just didn't exhibit the confidence that was needed. And you talk about earlier in this conversation about the need for communication, and we talked about President Trump in that sense. Hoover didn't have the chops in terms of the communication skills to get us through what was needed at the time. He just couldn't escape the narrative around this caricature that was built around him of being heartless, which he wasn't.
And the
Hoovervilles
and all that.
That. What's that?
Yeah, the Hoovervilles and all that.
Exactly. And I think in some ways you see President Carter, who's certainly a man of character, someone in the same way was a really good man, struggled with that aspect of confidence. He even had a speech called, it was the Crisis of Confidence speech. It was the Malaise speech. It was July of 1979. We're in the midst of an energy crisis. We're in the midst of a recession. And he talked about the challenges that America was facing at the time was because it was a crisis of confidence in the ability to get things done, and even hinted and pointed at his leadership as a means to those challenges. And a year later, he was voted out of office. It should be no surprise that FDR was voted in to replace Hoover. So I think confidence is everything in a leader, particularly in a crisis, and it goes across the board.
There's confidence and there's optimism, and that would be Ronald Reagan. He sort of became symbolic of this idea that America would be this shining city on a hill, thanks to the way he, he articulated that vision. How did he understand media, and how did his optimism drive the news coverage of the day?
He's a great communicator, right? Someone had been cultivating this across his life in terms of communication skills, from being a president of his class to getting into the communication skills around the Chicago Cubs in doing live broadcasting of games. Like, he was a sports broadcaster, then went into the movies and became an actor, and then became the spokesman for General Electric, two-term service as governor of California. He honed that craft over a lifetime. It was almost like he was building to the moment to be president around being a great communicator. Every job that he had prepared him for that aspect. And when we talk about optimism, this goes back to the heart of this book. It was something that he had been cultivating across his life. There was a hopeful sentiment that came from his mother. I mean, he struggled as a young boy. His father moved them around. He was a shoe salesman, and he just never stuck at things. His father was an alcoholic and sometimes would disappear for days at a time. And his mother instilled in him this optimism that everything was going to be all right. And even it just, things seemed to work out for him. And maybe it was the hopeful spirit that he had, but not getting into college, but then following his girlfriend into her college by going and talking to the president there and just asking to see if he could get some kind of scholarship, and then just working his way through things with this optimistic spirit. He was able to navigate really unique and difficult times. I mean, he was born in 1911. He was a product. He graduated the year of when the Great Depression crashed. He was a product of World War II and the Greatest Generation. So he had seen through crisis, but he always maintained that optimistic spirit. And I would argue that one of the most optimistic moments in American history, or in his presidency in particular, is when he told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall. And I think those 4 words are real optimistic words, because 29 months later, the wall fell down. But Reagan was able to give optimism to the people across the wall in East Berlin and across the Iron Curtain, that the President of the United States supported that wall coming down. And again, 29 months later, the wall came down.
I want to ask about you a little bit here. We've made it through year 6. I want to ask, why do you believe it's so important for people who write history to have at least served in some facet of government? How did your public service help you understand this to the point where you say, I've got to give words to this in a book?
Yeah, so I mean, I've loved presidential history going back to as far back as I can remember, and having the opportunity to not only study it from an academic point of view was an incredible opportunity, but the opportunity to parlay that at the White House and to see how decisions are made, to see and to walk the corridors of, this decision was made here, or that president said this here. For me, having the opportunity to do that, I was always looking at that experience through a historical lens, and knowing that was a critical component of hopefully writing books and thinking about this. But I think it's important to see how leaders make decisions, how leaders face crises. Why do some leaders succeed and some fail? And across not only the White House, but seeing how foreign diplomats make decisions, how foreign leaders make decisions, seeing that up close, being in meetings where you're writing demarche cables about the experience, or the notes, you being the note taker in a room, or experiencing being in a meeting with leaders. I think it's all gives you just another layer of just perspective when you look at good history. As I said earlier, I think good history is written after 30 or 40 years. There's aspects of classified documents or oral histories or gaining perspective on a time period. I think layering in your perspective on how you've seen leaders make decisions, how that's impacted certain time periods and perspectives. I think that all adds in. And I think you mentioned, or you're mentioning good history in that sense. It's people like Doris Kearns Goodwin had that experience with LBJ. You have Richard Neustadt. You have Arthur Schlesinger Jr. with John Kennedy. I think that that tradition is really important, and continuing that tradition is something I'm proud to have done and hope to continue to do.
What sources did you tap? These six presidents are some of the most, or well, let's just say it, they are the most studied presidents in American history, and the events themselves have been ripped apart in book after book after book after book. How did you try to make this different? What sources did you find to be most important to you?
I went right to the primary sources. So, I mean, each generation is going to interpret primary sources in a different way, right? You see things through a different lens based on your own perspective. I have a different perspective than someone who maybe hasn't worked in government just from having that experience. So I think going back, going and looking directly at the sources, trying to tease out and feel what those people were feeling in those moments, going back to their childhoods and seeing and reading their personal accounts, and maybe they had diaries, maybe they were writing about things or talking about things, or how they talked about them later. But really, from a historical lens, going back to the primary documents was the most important thing to me. I wanted to read Washington's letters. I wanted to read how he was feeling during his second term when he wrote about these aspects about national unity. So it's just to tighten that up is really going back to the core of who they were and the people that knew them best. Right? There's no one that knew Ronald Reagan better than Nancy Reagan. I think it's helpful to read her letter, read her comments, read and get at the core of that. But again, goes back to primary sources, and that was the hope of that. But also going back and looking at newspaper articles that were written in the moment, in the time period, to really get a sense of what was happening, what were the pressures these presidents were experiencing at the time. But all of it, at the end of the day, there's a collective aspect of pulling together historical record. But I like to go over to the primary sources first.
Which president had the best handwriting?
I like Ronald Reagan's. It's more modern in that sense, but I think they all have unique handwriting. I think I love going back and reading the Gettysburg Address in Abraham Lincoln's, as you saw, you just saw it recently, going back and looking at. But anytime I can get my hands on a primary source where you're actually holding the document that these six leaders were utilizing to make a decision, it's the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, it's crazy. All right. Since Reagan, we've had one, two, three, four, five, six. We've had six presidents, since Reagan. Give me some examples of maybe they didn't do something akin to the Gettysburg Address, but give me some of the highlights. George H.W. Bush through Joe Biden.
Yeah, George Herbert Walker Bush, I would argue that this aspect of fidelity, I think, is really important for George Herbert Walker Bush. You look at the Iraq charge he had in 1990 and gaining support for that, building out an international coalition to do it, and setting out to liberate Kuwait and stopping there. I think that was the mission was accomplished, and I think that there's an aspect of fidelity you see in George Herbert Walker Bush throughout his life and through his presidency that is, I think, exhibited in that particular moment. You look at someone like his son, George W. Bush.
Well, I was going to mention the bullhorn moment. I mean, to me, that moment was filled with so much opportunity. I mean, that really, when he stood on that pile, that was his I believe, highest moment as a leader. And what a moment that was.
It may be the highest moment in American history in terms of public opinion. At that, in the days after 9/11, he had a 90% approval rating, which is the highest ever in American history. And I would agree with you when the chants of USA, when he's standing there with the firefighter on the basic pile of rubble at ground zero. probably no more higher moment in terms of public opinion, or at least in terms of what Gallup has pulled together. That was an incredible moment. I would also argue for George W. Bush, his PEPFAR program, which is lesser known.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
It's more in international affairs, but this was AIDS relief for Africa that has saved tens of millions
Untold,
of
tens
people.
of millions. Yeah.
And it's something that the Obama administration continued and is continuing into today. And I think that's a legacy of just doing something for others that is in an American creed. It's that feeling of leaving it better for the next generation. And I think he certainly didn't have to do that at the time, but certainly that I think that's an important legacy for him. You look at someone like President Obama. I think all of this is still being written, but I think one of his signature moments was this sense of grace, sense of empathy in 2015 when after the Mother Emanuel church shootings in Charleston, and he went down there for Reverend Pinckney's who was killed in that shooting. He sang Amazing Grace in front of that entire congregation, and I think that was a really important moment in his presidency. It was also an important week in his presidency because there was some Supreme Court rulings around same-sex marriage. So there was, in terms of, that might have been his high point of his presidency in 2015, around that period of time. In terms of President Trump, you could look at one of the crises he faced was the pandemic in what it will be his first term. And there were certainly highs and lows in that experience, but I think that he did pull the weight of the federal government behind creating a vaccine, which was done in 9 months, and he called it himself the gold standard vaccine. Someone like Joe Biden, I think that's still being written. I think you've seen he's put a lot of work into climate change. If you look at that aspect of that lineage back to the Obama administration, but also going back to Theodore Roosevelt in this aspect of conservation and taking on an existential issue of the time. I think you look at wildfires in California that are burning, that you see the recent things around that. I think putting efforts into supporting climate change could be Joe Biden's signature. But again, that'll all be decided.
We have
So
time.
right now to
We have
decide
time.
that. Yeah,
We
exactly.
have time. How can we all learn to be better identifiers of qualities that candidates will bring to the White House that will make them leaders? What can we do as voters to better observe the people who are running for office?
Yeah, I think success leaves clues. There's a James Barber, a great political scientist in the 1950s, wrote about presidential character and this idea of can we kind of pluck that out ahead of time? Can we see what they've done in the past to help us make a decision? And I would argue yes. I mean, to some degree, I've found that in each of these 6 leaders, there was a quality that they exhibited out their life, they cultivated throughout their life that came to the fore at their most crucial moment. And I think it's important to look at that. What are some things in if we look at our most recent election, we look at President Trump certainly left clues throughout his life. Joe Biden certainly left clues throughout his life. And I think it's important it's part of the holistic view of picking a candidate. If you wanted to take into account their experience, I think it's really important. But I'll also note that I think it's not only important to select a president in terms of their experience, but I think it's important for us to think about what are the qualities that we're going to exhibit in meeting our moment. Maybe we have met our moment, maybe we haven't. But if we haven't, what is it about us, and what have we been cultivating across our life? Is it an aspect of courage or confidence or optimism or judgment? Any of these qualities that has been something that's been with us on our journey? Is it something that's going to help us ultimately to meet our moment in our career, in the classroom, in a corporate boardroom, in making a moral, ethical decision? So I think not only in terms of selecting presidents, but something for us to think about as well in terms of how we're going to meet our moment when the time comes.
This book is dedicated to many people in your life. I read your acknowledgments, but you ended with Erin and Catherine. I love asking authors about this. Who are Erin and Catherine, and how do they inspire you, as you put it?
Well, they are the best. That is my wife and my daughter. And
I
if it
get.
wasn't
I
for my,
figured that. I figured
and
that.
if it wasn't for my wife telling me to write this book, she didn't want to hear me say that I was going to write this book, and I got to get this done, and it's just the slow roll around it. If it wasn't for her, this wouldn't have happened. So I would owe it to her in that sense. But it was a lot of 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the mornings, getting up before the world starts and writing this, and I owe it to her to push me to get it done. And it was one of the best gifts she could give me, and certainly just the inspiration of my daughter and just them is a gift.
One of the things I love, yeah, I've met so many authors doing this podcast, and the old saw that, oh, it would be so much fun to write a book. The authors all say, "What, are you kidding me? It's the opposite of fun to write a book."
I found it was almost therapeutic. I enjoyed the process. I think once you get into a rhythm, it's a lot easier. I think the key is just starting, and anybody who is struggling with that, I think it's just setting time, quiet time, uninterrupted time to do it. And I promise you, you'll get it done.
Do you think you'll do it again? Is there going to be another book for you? I know you're busy with
Definitely.
the
I've
University of.
enjoyed this process so much. And it's just, I've loved doing this, studying the American presidency for so long. This book has been an idea that goes back to my graduate school days, just thinking about the qualities of leadership. And it's certainly something I was thinking about over the course of my time in government. But certainly, I like hopeful books. I like the books that inspire people to think that leadership matters, that character matters, and it'll certainly be a book on the presidency for sure. And I'm looking forward to getting that out, hopefully soon. I don't know when that'll happen, but that's the goal.
You got to set your alarm clock for 3 in the morning again. Dr. William Haldeman, the author of Meeting the Moment, Inspiring Presidential Leadership That Transformed America. Thanks so much for being here.
Evan, I enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me.
Check out the book and his website, williamhaldeman.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at POTUS Historian. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.